It has been nearly a week since the quiet exclusivity of Brentwood was shattered by a crime so visceral it has left the community in a state of suspended paralysis. While the initial headlines announced the devastating loss of Rob and Michelle Reiner, new layers of the investigation are now coming to light, reconstructing a narrative that is far more harrowing than previously imagined. Emerging forensic details suggest the violence inflicted was not merely fatal, but deeply personal. The lethal wounds, particularly severe lacerations to the throat, have been interpreted by investigators as a brutal, final command to silence the victims. This explosion of rage reportedly didn't manifest out of thin air, but was the tragic crescendo of a deterioration that began days earlier, marked by Nick Reiner's erratic and unnerving behavior at a holiday gathering hosted by Conan O'Brien. In a twist that adds a layer of macabre irony to the proceedings, the accused is now securing his defense using the very legacy of the parents he is charged with killing, hiring high-profile attorney Alan Jackson with funds drawn from the Reiner estate. The timeline of the attack, as outlined by the Los Angeles District Attorney, paints a picture of a nightmare unfolding in the sanctuary of a sleeping home. Prosecutors believe the fatal sequence occurred in the dead of night, likely between the hours of 1:27 a.m. and 6 a.m. There was no sound of breaking glass or splintering wood to signal the danger. Nick allegedly used his own keys, ghosting into the main residence and entering the master bedroom without leaving a trace of forced entry. Following the carnage, the suspect did not flee in a panic, but rather exited with a disturbing sense of purpose. By 4:00 a.m., while his parents lay dead, Nick had driven 20 minutes to the coast, checking into the Pierside Hotel in Santa Monica. He paid for the room without drawing attention, a mundane transaction that allowed him to vanish into the anonymity of a hotel room while the crime scene remained undiscovered. The grim reality of the situation was only unveiled nearly 12 hours later. At approximately 3:40 p.m., a massage therapist arrived for a scheduled session only to be met with an unnerving silence. When repeated knocks went unanswered, she contacted the couple's daughter, Romy. It was Romy who rushed to the estate and made the heart-stopping discovery, finding her father in the master bedroom and, frantically, dialing 911. As police secured the scene and located Michelle's body nearby, a manhunt for Nick quietly intensified across the city. The final act of his flight played out under the harsh fluorescent lights of an Arco gas station near Exposition Park. Surveillance footage from 9:00 p.m. shows Nick purchasing a sports drink, his eyes darting nervously, but his demeanor largely composed. 15 minutes later, the net closed. LAPD officers and U.S. Marshals surrounded him, and without a struggle, the 32-year-old surrendered, offering only a hollow, exhausted stare as the handcuffs were applied. As the investigation turned inward, focusing on the silent, blood-soaked corridors of the Brentwood estate, the forensic evidence began to tell a story far more gruesome than a simple act of violence. By the time emergency responders breached the master bedroom, the biological clock of death had already been ticking for hours. Rigor mortis had set in, and the cooling of the body suggested that Rob and Michelle had been deceased for approximately 3 to 4 hours before they were found. This window of time reveals a chilling possibility that investigators are now exploring. The suspect did not just kill and run. There is a strong likelihood that Nick Reiner lingered in the aftermath, possibly using the home's own bathrooms to wash the blood from his skin, or showering at the hotel later, though traces of the carnage would inevitably cling to him. The weapon itself speaks to a crime of opportunity rather than complex planning. Experts believe a common kitchen utensil, perhaps a chef's knife or a meat cleaver, was pulled from the family's own drawers. Nick's intimate knowledge of the house meant he needed no specialized gear, just the ruthless precision to turn a domestic tool into an instrument of death. The autopsy reports have since confirmed the true extent of the brutality, classifying the cause of death as throat slashing. But the reality is far more chaotic. Initially reported as a single cut, further examination revealed a frenzy of multiple stab wounds inflicted upon both victims. Forensic expert Joseph Scott Morgan, host of the program Body Bags, analyzes this pattern as a textbook definition of overkill. In the language of forensics, this level of violence transcends the need to simply end a life. It represents a psychological explosion, a sequence of attacks requiring immense physical energy and a total invasion of the victim's personal space. These were not injuries inflicted from a distance. To execute such deep slashing wounds across the throat, the attacker would likely have to restrain the victims using body weight to pin them down against the mattress, turning their own bed, a place of safety and rest, into a trap from which there was no escape. This specific combination of long sweeping slashes and deep puncture wounds suggests that the assault was not a momentary lapse of judgment, but a prolonged, deliberate release of rage. Morgan notes that cutting a throat is rarely the clean, quick action seen in movies. It is a messy, physically demanding struggle that requires the perpetrator to be intimately close to the dying victims. The horror is compounded by the belief that Rob and Michelle were attacked while vulnerable in their sleep. For the killer to approach them so closely without triggering an alarm or waking them prematurely, he had to know the creak of every floorboard and the depth of their slumber. This was not a stranger's intrusion. It was a violation committed by someone who knew exactly how to navigate the dark silence of the home. The sheer volume of blood lost from the major arteries would have been catastrophic, spraying the room and the attacker alike. Yet, the evidence points to a singular, devastating conclusion. Only someone like Nick, a ghost in his own family's house, could have entered that room and unleashed such fury without raising a single suspicion until it was far too late. With Nick Reiner sitting in a cell, stripped of his freedom, and facing charges that could end his life as a free man, A new and unsettling question has begun to dominate the conversation outside the jailhouse walls. Who is paying for his survival? The man standing between Nick and the full weight of the justice system is Alan Jackson, a legal titan whose reputation in American criminal defense is nothing short of legendary. Jackson is the attorney of choice for the desperate and the wealthy, a litigator known for navigating the most complex media-saturated storms. But this caliber of defense comes with a staggering price tag. In previous high-profile cases, legal bills have soared upwards of $10 million a sum that Nick Reiner, a man with no significant career who had spent years drifting through addiction and relying on his parents' financial support, could never hope to afford on his own. When pressed by reporters outside the courthouse, Jackson offered a practiced no comment regarding his fees, a silence that only fueled the growing fire of speculation. However, sources close to the shattered remains of the Reiner family have confirmed a detail that adds a layer of Shakespearean tragedy to the proceedings. The war chest funding Nick's defense is reportedly being drawn from the very fortune built by the victims he is accused of slaughtering. The estate of Rob and Michelle Reiner, estimated to be worth nearly $200 million, is now the lifeline for the son charged with ending their lives. This decision, seemingly paradoxical to the outside observer, is driven by the surviving family members, including Nick's siblings, Jake and Romy. Despite their profound grief and the horror of finding their parents dead, they have chosen not to abandon their brother to the mercy of a public defender. Their motivation is not to help a murderer escape justice, but to secure a specific kind of mercy. They are reportedly aiming for a defense centered on insanity and mental defect. The family's hope is that a high-powered legal team can steer the verdict away from a life sentence in a supermax prison and toward confinement in a high-security psychiatric facility. It is a decision born from a fractured kind of love, a belief that despite the carnage, Rob and Michelle would have wanted their son treated as a patient rather than a monster. Legally, this creates a complex web. Under California's Slayer rule, a convicted murderer cannot inherit from their victims, but until a gavel falls and guilt is proven, the estate's executors have the discretion to authorize funds for legal defense. Thus, in a cruel twist of fate, the wealth Rob Reiner accumulated over a lifetime of making audiences laugh is now being burned to save his son from the consequences of a night that made the world cry. The courtroom battle is set to be fierce, but the moral conflict is already raging. Can money earned by the victims ethically be used to defend their killer? To truly understand the explosion of violence that consumed the Reiner home, one must first navigate the long, tortured history of the man at its center. Nick Reiner's life was scripted as a Hollywood fairy tale, born into a dynasty of comedy legends, the son of Rob and the grandson of Carl. Yet beneath the veneer of red carpets and prestige. A much darker narrative was taking shape. His descent began not in adulthood, but in the fragile years of adolescence. By the age of 15, around 2008, Nick had already begun to drift away from the glittering world he was born into, finding solace in the numbing embrace of heroin and cocaine. It was the start of a war that his family would fight alongside him. For nearly 2 decades, a battle waged with the best medical care money could buy, yet one that ultimately proved unwinnable. The cycle was relentless and exhausting. Over the years, Rob and Michelle sent their son to rehabilitation centers at least 17 times, a revolving door of recovery and relapse that spun with dizzying speed. Nick himself would later describe this period as a trap. He would stay sober just long enough to earn his way back into the family fold, only to slip back into the abyss almost immediately. For a brief moment in 2015, there was a glimmer of genuine hope. At 22, Nick channeled his pain into art, co-writing the film Being Charlie with his father. The project was a semi-autobiographical mirror of his own struggles, a creative catharsis that brought father and son closer than they had been in years. It seemed for a fleeting season that the demons had been exorcised through the power of storytelling, but the reprieve was cruel in its brevity. By 2018, the darkness had returned with a vengeance. Nick admitted to a heavy relapse into heroin, a downward spiral, punctuated by a terrifying near-death experience on an airplane caused by a cocaine-induced heart incident. His behavior grew increasingly volatile, culminating in a rampage where he destroyed the interior of his parents' guest house, shattering furniture and lights in a blind, drug-fueled haze. Faced with a son they could no longer control, Rob and Michelle were forced to make the heart-wrenching decision to practice tough love, expelling him from the sanctuary of Brentwood. This led to what Nick called his bleakest years, a period of homelessness where he drifted like a phantom across states like Maine, Texas, and New Jersey, surviving on the streets by sheer luck and the charity of strangers. When he was finally allowed to return to the main house in 2020, it was an act of desperate parental protection, a final attempt to keep him close and safe. Sadly, this decision to bring him back into the heart of the home would not result in his salvation, but would instead set the stage for the ultimate tragedy. The final act of this family tragedy began to unfold under the deceivingly bright lights of a holiday celebration. On the evening of Saturday, December 13th, the elite of Hollywood gathered at the West Los Angeles home of comedian Conan O'Brien for his highly anticipated annual Christmas party. It was a sanctuary for the famous, a place where stars could lower their guard. But for Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer, it became the stage for a public unraveling. They arrived not just as a couple, but as concerned parents, bringing Nick along in a decision that friends now view with heartbreaking clarity. In the weeks leading up to this night, Nick's stability had been fracturing. The late-night wanderings and inexplicable phone calls had terrified his parents, compelling them to keep him close rather than leave him unsupervised in the empty expanse of the Brentwood estate. They brought him into the warmth of the party, hoping the atmosphere might anchor him, but instead it highlighted just how far he had drifted. While Rob and Michelle mingled with effortless grace, Rob embracing their host and Michelle elegant in a dark evening gown, Nick stood as a stark anomaly. Clad in a worn gray hoodie with the hood pulled low, he moved through the room like a specter, his presence radiating a palpable tension that unsettled the guests. He didn't socialize. He interrogated. Witnesses describe him cornering celebrities with an unblinking, invasive intensity. He approached Jane Fonda, standing too close, his silence heavy and unnerving. But the behavior escalated during an encounter with actor Bill Hader. Nick reportedly interrupted a private conversation, demanding to know Hader's full name and asking if he was famous, his voice flat and devoid of social awareness. When Hader attempted to politely deflect the intrusion, Nick didn't retreat. He stood his ground, staring fixedly until the discomfort in the air became suffocating. The situation reached its breaking point when Rob Reiner, realizing the scene his son was causing, intervened. He pulled Nick away from the crowd into a secluded corridor, but the privacy was short-lived. The low murmur of the party was cut by the sharp rising sounds of a father's desperate frustration. Guests in adjacent rooms could hear the argument escalate, a verbal struggle between a father trying to impose order and a son who had long since stopped listening. Rob's voice carried the weight of exhaustion, scolding Nick for his aggression, while Michelle stood by a mediator trapped in the crossfire. The confrontation ended not with a resolution, but with a retreat. Rob and Michelle made the decision to leave the party early, their faces etched with worry. As they walked away, witnesses recall them casting one final lingering look at their son, a glance of unconditional love mixed with helpless fear. It was a poignant, tragic tableau, the parents departing into the night, unaware that the storm they were trying to outrun was about to follow them home. The curtain rose on the next act of this tragedy, not on a film set, but within the stark, fluorescent-lit confines of a Los Angeles courtroom. When Nick Reiner finally appeared before a judge, the transformation was absolute. Gone was the privileged son of Hollywood royalty. In his place sat a defendant clad in the distinctive blue safety vest of the county jail, a garment designed for those on suicide watch, and a grim symbol of his total downfall. Beside him stood Alan Jackson, projecting the confidence of a defense team ready for war. Yet the hearing itself was defined by a suffocating brevity. Cameras were barred from the proceedings, intensifying the mystery, leaving the world to rely on courtroom sketches and reporter descriptions of a young man who looked hollowed out, his expression a mask of weary detachment. The legal strategy began to take shape immediately. Jackson requested a postponement of the formal arraignment, a tactical move to buy time before entering a plea. When the judge addressed the accused directly, asking if he waived his right to a speedy trial to allow for this delay until January 7th, 2026. The courtroom held its breath. Nick's response was a brief, robotic monotone. "Yes, Your Honor." Those 3 words were the only glimpse into his mind. The public received no tears, no outbursts, no desperate pleas for forgiveness. The hearing concluded in minutes, but the battle lines have now been drawn. The prosecution is expected to leverage the overwhelming forensic evidence, the overkill nature of the wounds, the lack of forced entry, and the cold timeline of his movements to paint a picture of premeditated slaughter. Conversely, the defense will likely weave a narrative of a mind so broken by decades of chemical abuse that it could no longer distinguish between nightmare and reality. As we look toward the trial, the tragedy of the Reiner family serves as a devastating reminder of the limits of love. Rob and Michelle Reiner spent half a lifetime trying to save their son, employing every resource, every therapist, and every ounce of patience they possessed. They operated on the belief that a parent's job is to never give up, to keep the door open, no matter how dark the night becomes. It is the cruelest of ironies that it was this very open door that allowed the darkness to finally consume them. The story of what happened in that Brentwood bedroom is no longer just a celebrity news item. It is a modern American tragedy about the destruction of a family from the inside out. As the world waits for justice to be served, we are left with the haunting question that lingers long after the headlines fade. When you invite a troubled soul back home, are you offering them sanctuary, or are you stepping into their storm?